Steinbeck wants us to make sure that we are getting it. So he gives us one of his famous interlude chapters where we put on pause the plot of the story, we put on pause the character development, and rather we just breathe for a moment and look around. And Steinbeck gives us some of his thoughts. It seems as though many people interpret Steinbeck as this is his worldview and philosophy all wrapped up nicely into just a few pages. I prefer to read these pages as more of a map of how to read the book, how to understand story in general, and particularly his what he wanted to be his greatest novel. And so he wants us to know that the only thing that really matters is good and evil. That's the one story. That's the thread throughout all human life and what all stories are based on. And if you stop listening and just make some assumptions right at the beginning of this chapter, that sounds a little preachy, a little simplistic, but then if you see his broad definitions of virtue and vice, good and evil, I think it makes it more palatable and more believable to understand what he isn't saying in this chapter, which is every moment of life on every emotional and intellectual level is this vigorous battle between good and evil. I don't think that's what he's saying if we just listen to him in this chapter and hear how he defines virtue and vice, good and evil. And basically he says that is an open question and you can't decide that until someone is dead, which is an interesting place to put this discussion because Adam and Cal and Aaron and Abra and Lee are still very much alive, and so their fate has not been decided yet. They could still screw it up or they could still redeem their lives, and so the little stories from history are meant to illustrate that fact, that it's simply too soon in the novel to have written somebody off. Well, maybe it's not too soon to have written Kathy off. I certainly have. But for all the other characters, it's too soon to have written them off or to have done the opposite, to created a hagiography of them. And so we need to wait till someone is dead, and then that will determine whether they had a lucky or a virtuous life. And it's interesting how he defines virtue or good or evil. He defines it as being loved. And so that changes the tenor, I think, from a preachy, moralistic way of looking at life and rather a general view of life. And so really what Steinbeck is saying is we have to wait until a character or a real person dies before we can realize whether their entire life sum, whether their lovable deeds outweighed their unlovable deeds, whether the good that they brought to this world outweighed the bad they did to this world. And so he uses three historical examples of a rich man who probably stepped on a lot of people to become rich, and then he spent the second half of his life trying to pay back and squelch those demons, and then a second man who was truly evil, and a third man who didn't do everything right, but his intentions were to be good. And so those are the examples, and I think we're supposed to look back on our characters, particularly Samuel Hamilton, but to look forward to Adam Trask and say, what kind of life is he going to have? Is he going to be a Desi who leaves behind all sorts of women in Salinas who loved her, Tom, who John Steinbeck and his sister loved? Is he going to be Samuel Hamilton? Is he going to leave behind in his wake people who are truly sad to see him gone? Or is Adam going to turn out like some of these men from history? And so that's really the point of the chapter, is to see these characters all the way through to the end, and only then can we ask, were they full of virtue or were they full of vice?